Hello and welcome back. So we're going to be trying something a little bit different for this series of lectures. I'm just going to be having the PowerPoint slides with narration over them that you can watch. So now if ethics is defined as the study of good and bad actions or good and bad persons, and by what mark you can know them by, or in other words, giving a normative theory, then what we need to do is first deal with the relativists, because we're making an assumption here, namely that there is such a thing as good actions, good persons. And of course the relativist thinks that there really in a real sense isn't in reality good actions or good persons. So if they're right, then we may as well just go home. There's no point in our doing ethics. So it's just going to end up being a waste of time. So we need to deal with this challenge before we get to doing any kind of normative theory at all. And in fact, what we're going to see is a large part of normative theorizing or meta-ethical theorizing in general is aimed at trying to deal with relativism. Well, let's define relativism a little bit more seriously. So relativism, as we'll be understanding the term, is the view that there is no absolute moral truth. Or to put that in another way, so you can say it one of two ways, right? You can say, look, either there is no absolute truth, or you can say what counts as true depends on either what a person believes, that's subjectivism as defined here, or what a culture believes. So now, the relativist does believe that there is moral truth in that sense, since what's morally true is relative to the culture, let's say. And so you can say that for Americans, free speech is good. That's something that Americans believe, that freedom of speech should be allowed. So that's true for Americans, but of course it's not, according to the relativist, true for everyone. It's only true for that group. So you can either say there's no absolute truth, or what truth there is relative to a certain kind of group. Now, relativism in morality is inspired by the kinds of relativism that we find in our everyday ordinary lives. So some things really are relative. Here for instance, is something that seems obviously a candidate for relativism. So I like chocolate ice cream. I think chocolate ice cream is delicious. Then I find out that you think that vanilla ice cream is delicious, and in fact that you don't like chocolate ice cream. I find that very strange. I say, how could you not like chocolate ice cream? It's the best. You say, what do you mean? How could you not like vanilla ice cream? That's the best. So here we have what seems to be a disagreement over what flavor of ice cream is the best. But if we think about it, we'll see there's no real sense in which there's a fact which we're arguing about here, since whether you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream doesn't have to do with some objective state of affairs in reality, but just seems to depend on you and your individual preferences and tastes. So some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla. It's not as though I can say that you're missing out on some fact. I could say, well, gee, I really like chocolate. I don't understand why you don't like it. And of course I don't understand why you don't like it, because I am thinking I like it, but you have your tastes, and ultimately neither of us is really wrong when we say that chocolate is the best, right? It's true for me that chocolate is the best for me, and it's true for you that vanilla is the best for you. So that's a case where you really have relativism. There's no absolute truth about whether chocolate tastes good or not, and the only truth that you get is relative to a particular individual. Excuse me. So here's another area where relativism seems to be true. So take, for instance, the question of whether men should wear skirts. So in America, that's frowned upon heavily. You don't see men wearing these kinds of outfits. But of course, as everyone knows, in Scotland, it's considered fashionable when men dress up to wear a kilt. Now, they don't call it a skirt, but it's a skirt-like type thing, and skirtish enough that an American man wouldn't want to wear it. So now, here's a question. They say you should dress this way. We say you shouldn't dress that way. Who's right in this case? And it seems like the answer that we give here is the relativist one. Well, they're both right. It's just fashion. This culture dresses this way, that culture dresses that way. There's no better way, there's no right way of doing it. You wear a headdress, a turban, you don't. Some cultures do this, some cultures don't. So for that culture, that's right for them. For our culture, this is right for us. Relativism. Now, of course, humor seems also to be in this category. What you find funny seems to be relative. This might be relative to a culture, again, or a society, or to an individual. It's not really clear which way to go with this, but you can kind of see it going both ways. So I think Seinfeld is very funny, but I know plenty of people who don't think it's funny. And interestingly enough, a lot of people who I know that are into hip hop culture and these kinds of things don't find Seinfeld funny. I don't know if that's a cultural difference or an individual preference or not, but there's something there that's interesting. Now, take something like Seinfeld and contrast it with something like the Three Stooges. Some people think that's hilarious, other people don't. Or take some kind of comedy that you might find on a Telemundo show. Some people find that to be extremely funny, some other people don't. So again, this seems to be just depending on your individual preferences or tastes. Okay, so, and then finally, there are all kinds of concepts in our ordinary language which, when seen to be objective, but when we look at them more closely, reveal themselves to be relativistic. So, being large, for instance, when you judge that something is large, you're really making a judgment that contains a hidden relativity to it. So, for instance, when you look at an ant and you say, that's a big ant, that ant's very large, of course, what you mean is that the ant is large for an ant. Because a large ant is, of course, very small when you compare it to a large elephant. And when you look at an elephant and you say, that's a large elephant, well, again, that's relative to being an elephant. You're saying that's large for an elephant, because a large elephant is not very large, not very big when compared to a large planet. So we can say, well, that's a large planet, that's a smaller planet. So, for instance, Jupiter, much larger, Saturn, large planet, Earth, relatively small planet. So what counts as large for a planet is, of course, much larger than what counts as large for an elephant, which is, of course, much larger than what counts as large for an ant, which is, of course, much larger than what counts as large for an atom, and etc., and etc. So these kinds of things are relative. And then finally, something people don't think about, but which is clearly relative as well, is judgment about time. So we say, oh, it's 4 o'clock, as though there's some objective fact about what time it is. But really, there's just an agreement on our part that the time will be this, as determined by the position of the sun. And so, therefore, people on the West Coast, of course, will disagree with us, and we'll both be right. So I'll say it's 4 o'clock, they'll say it's 1 o'clock. Neither of us is wrong. It's not as though I'm making a mistake or they're making a mistake. We're both right because it's 4 o'clock here and 1 o'clock there. So relativity is everywhere. And we can see, of course, that the two kinds of relativity that are in the moral realm are also out there in these other areas. So there are chocolate and vanilla is clearly a case where subjectivism seems to be the intuitive choice, whereas things like fashion seem to be intuitively things like cultures, which make the determination. So there does seem to be kinds of things out there which admit of this kind of relativity. The question, of course, for us is, well, maybe that's true, but why think that that's true for morality? Because there are things out there which don't seem to be relative in this kind of way. For instance, mathematics immediately springs to mind. Whether 2 plus 2 is 4 doesn't seem to depend on a person's preferences, and it certainly doesn't seem to depend on a person's culture either. So you could make the same case about logic, for instance, various argument forms and things like validity and so on, although it does get a bit more complicated there. The point is that if not everything is relative, then we need to ask the question, why think that morality is relative? Well, this is a very old question. It turns out that by far the most compelling argument that's ever been given is something that's called the cultural differences argument, and it's put in different ways by different people. But here is the way that we'll put it for this class. So the first premise starts by pointing out that, well, if there were an absolute truth about morality, then cultures wouldn't vary in their moral beliefs. And the reason that this premise is intuitively plausible is because of the kinds of examples I gave to support the claim that some things are objective. So take mathematics. There is no culture that we've ever discovered that thinks that 2 plus 2 is 5. We have never met some far removed culture deep in the rainforest of some undiscovered territory where they think that triangles have 4 sides. This just doesn't happen. There is universal agreement about mathematics. And also, notice, mathematics was one of the candidates for being objective. So the idea is, look, where there's real objectivity, where there is a real truth of the matter, then you have universal agreement. So if there were an absolute truth about morality, then you wouldn't find cultures varying in their moral beliefs. Now the second premise just kind of points out, but hey, cultures do vary in their moral beliefs. There are thousands of examples of this, ranging from the ones that are currently very much the center of attention, like for instance, in certain countries, women don't have the same rights that they do here. They can't vote, they can't own property. So in Saudi Arabia, for instance, women cannot be out during daylight hours unescorted by a male. They can't learn to read or write. It's illegal to teach a woman in school, so they can't go to college, for instance. So whereas in America, we think that women do have these rights. They were fought for very hardly during the suffrage movement, and so on. So that seems to be a clear case where we differ in our moral values. And this goes on and on. So infamously, in the 90s, in the 80s, there was a big outrage over what was known as female genital mutilation, which is basically where they take the hood of the clitoris and remove it when a woman reaches a certain age. And this was decried as barbaric and so on and so on. But in some cultures, this is considered a rite of passage in the normal way that a woman becomes a woman. And they would point out, look, there is no difference between this in principle and circumcision in America. But notice no one is calling circumcision male genital mutilation. So here's a case where people think, well, look, that culture, they do it their way, and in those cultures, allow them to perform those kinds of things, but in our culture, we don't perform those kinds of actions. The list goes on and on. So another very famous example of this is when the British first came into India, they discovered there was a practice amongst the Indians that when a man died, his wife would throw herself onto the funeral pyre and be burned alive, and it was considered her duty to do that. And the British, of course, were horrified by that, but they thought, well, they struggled very mightily with this, and their conclusion was, like, this is the way they do it. Who are we to say that they shouldn't do it that way? Eventually, this practice was outlawed, but it took a while. So the second premise seems to be obvious, although we'll come back to that later and wonder if it really is that obvious. But this argument seems intuitively convincing. There's just all too much disagreement about this subject matter of ethics for us to take it seriously, the idea that there's some objectivity there. The problem of this is that this argument is no good. So consider the following argument, which is exactly the same in structure, but reveals the flaw in the original. So suppose someone said, look, if there were an absolute truth about the shape of the earth, then cultures would not vary in their beliefs about its shape. But believe it or not, cultures do vary in their belief about the shape of the earth. So in ancient Greece, for instance, they thought that the earth was variously shaped, but flat. And for a long time, people thought the earth was flat because it sort of appears that way. But then again, it's obviously crazy to say, well, look, just because people disagree about the shape of the earth, therefore there is no shape that the earth has. You can't say that it's really flat or spherical because people disagree about it. So this clearly isn't a good argument that the earth has a shape or one shape or the other. It's either flat or spherical. The fact that people don't agree on that is not evidence, therefore, that it has no shape. What it is evidence for, actually, is that we might not know the shape of the earth. And that's an important distinction, the distinction between reality being a certain way, or as we say in philosophy, the metaphysics being a certain way, and our knowing that it's that way, or in other words, an epistemological claim. So here's another way of illustrating this point. Consider God. So you might say, look, if there is an absolute truth about the existence of God, then cultures wouldn't vary in their beliefs about God. But cultures do vary in their beliefs about God. Some people believe in the Hindu gods. Some cultures believe in the Muslim God. Some cultures believe in the Christian God. Some cultures believe in the Jewish God, etc., etc. So there's this variation in beliefs about the nature of God. But yet we are not tempted to conclude that there is no absolute truth about the existence of God. There is either one God or many gods or zero gods. Reality is the way that it is, we think, and our not knowing it is no evidence that it isn't the way that it is. So we see a pattern here in both of these examples. What we see is that, look, what's going on is people are concluding from the fact that there is disagreement about a certain area that there's no fact of the matter about the way that area is. But that's clearly a bad pattern of argument. So as I was saying before, that's an epistemological conclusion. Namely, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with what can be known. So what these arguments are suggesting is not that morality isn't a certain way, but that it's not known by us, the right morality, since there's all this disagreement. We haven't got a metaphysical conclusion, namely, we haven't got the conclusion that there is no fact of the matter. Now, we need to be careful here because we haven't done anything to show that relativism isn't true. All we've done is to cast some doubt on the main reason for believing that relativism is true. So we don't have any evidence for it being true, but it may still be true nonetheless. What we would need is another argument to believe it, because the one that's been given so far doesn't work. So what we want to do now is turn to looking at what kinds of other arguments could be given for the truth of relativism. Well, one of the central challenges to the idea that there are absolute moral truths, or what the book calls absolutism, is to try to show what kind of foundation there could be for moral commands. So let's back up a second. When we consider some simple sentences, like for instance this sentence, dogs are mammals, you can see that there are two parts to it, which we call in English the subject and the predicate. And there's a very natural tendency to think that these two grammatical categories, subject and predicate, correspond to two metaphysical categories of object and property. So dog is the subject here, and it seems to pick out a certain group in the world. Mammal picks out a property that things in that group can have. And what the sentence tells us there is that dogs have the property of being mammals. We can then straightforwardly say that this sentence is true when dogs do in fact have that property. Or in other words, when this sentence correctly describes the way that the world is. Now, the moral absolutist claims that moral sentences can be true or false, just like dogs are mammals. That's a straightforwardly true or false sentence. It's true if dogs are mammals and false if not. Now, if I say that trout are mammals, that's a false sentence because it doesn't correctly describe a trout. Now, if the absolutist is right, then moral sentences work just like that, and they're saying they're true in a real sense, just like trouts are mammals and dogs are mammals can be true or false. One of those is true and one of those is false. It doesn't depend on you or what you think about it or how you feel about it. It only depends on the way dogs are and the way mammals are. So now look at the sentence, rape is wrong. It looks just like dogs are mammals. It has a subject and it has a predicate. What is it, though, that makes it true? So we can think about the action of raping. It's a certain action. This sentence says that it has the property of being wrong. What does that mean? In the mammal's case, we can say what it is to have the property of being a mammal, giving birth to live young. It's just a descriptive thing. Some objects do that, other objects don't. Well, what's going on in the case of wrong? Building off our earlier naturalistic fallacy arguments, what we need here is something that we can, of the form, being wrong is, and then we say what it is to be wrong. And then we can look in the world and see if various objects have that property and various objects don't have that property. Now, the no foundation argument is basically the claim that there's nothing that can fill that role. That every time we go to the world to try to find the thing which makes moral sentences true, the only thing which works is simply preferences or cultural norms. So the no foundation argument is supposed to be an argument for relativism. It's an argument for relativism by being an argument against absolutism. So the no foundation argument is basically saying this: look, you have a choice between absolutism and relativism. The absolutist says this, that moral sentences are true in an objective, mind-independent way. But we can't make any sense of what that means. What does the world look like? Where is the property of being wrong? It doesn't seem like it's a natural property. What other kind of property could it be? Now, we can make this exact same point in terms of commands, because morality can be viewed as a collection of commands. So, for instance, rape is wrong, the sentence, entails the command, do not rape. So when we think about morality, we normally think about injunctions against behavior, whereas an injunction is a command not to do something. So we think, don't lie, don't rape, do tell the truth, do donate to charity. But then the no foundation intuition comes into play. Where does the authority of moral commands come from? It seems intuitively obvious that I shouldn't just follow any old command that I encounter. If your roommate commands you to do something, you come home and your roommate says, I order you to go bring me some French fries. Well, you would be well within your rights to demand to know who he thought he was. Who are you to order me around? I don't have to obey your orders. Or if you're walking down the street and some random person comes to you and says, give me your money. So, but why? Well, if they have a gun, maybe that's some kind of reason. But there's a question about whether the command is legitimate, whether it has authority over you. Not every command has authority over every person. But the moral absolutist claims that there are certain commands, moral commands, which have authority over all persons. So the command, do not rape, is something that all persons ought to obey, whether they want to or not. It's not like the roommate case. If he says, go get me some French fries, and you feel like a nice person, you can say, all right, I will. So you obey the order, but you didn't have to obey the order. You could have just as well said, no, I won't do it. So the question here then is, what gives morality this distinctive authority? Now, these two questions, namely, what makes a moral statement true? What gives moral commands their authority? Give rise to the no foundation argument. Now, the point here is supposed to be there's no way to answer these questions in any other way than, what gives rise to the authority of morality? One's culture, one's preferences. What makes a moral sentence true? That a culture says do it or don't do it. So there clearly that would be an answer to these problems if you were a relativist. If relativism was true, you would have a straightforward, very sort of easy to understand answer to the question, what makes a moral statement true? Well, that a culture says do it, or that a person wants to do it. So that's the no foundation argument. But of course, the problem with it is that it's inconclusive at this point, in our journey anyway, because philosophers have, for thousands of years, tried to answer the no foundation argument. What we're going to be doing is looking at various answers to the no foundation argument. And traditionally, there have been sort of three very popular answers to this problem. So the first one is sort of immediately, intuitively obvious. What gives moral commands their authority? Well, they have their authority based on the authority of God is one popular answer. So God commands us to do certain things. He says, don't lie. It's then a moral rule that lying is wrong, because lying is wrong just means commanded by God not to be done. Well, the authority comes from God's authority. He's the ultimate authority. What makes a moral statement true? Well, you say lying is wrong is true if God commanded us not to do it. So if someone said lying is morally good, you could say, no, that's false, by which you would simply mean God has not told us to lie. So that's one very popular answer to this question. You can see why. It's a very old and honorable tradition. Now, of course, as with any old and honorable tradition, it has its problems. And so what we're going to do is come back to this a bit later and look at some of the traditional problems associated with the claim that God is the foundation for morality. Now, another very popular attempt to solve this problem is to try to say that it has something to do with self-interest. Now, clearly, we all have a reason to do what's in our own self-interest. We all want to preserve ourselves, and looking after our own self-interest is a good way of doing that. Now, it may seem sort of obvious that being self-interested is not the same thing as being moral, but there's a few interesting arguments that we're going to look at which suggest that this isn't right. Or, in other words, they suggest that the foundation for morality may ultimately be self-interest. We can't evaluate that right now, but this is what we're going to come back to. Now, finally, the other candidate that you find in this area is rationality. And it needs to be said right at the beginning that by rationality, what we are talking about is the kinds of things that happen in a formal logic class. So, for instance, from the fact that all men are mortal and the fact that Socrates is a man, it follows of necessity that Socrates is immortal. Someone who accepted that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, but who denied that Socrates was mortal, would be contradicting themselves in a fundamentally irrational, illogical way. They would be asserting something, namely that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, but denying what follows from that, namely that Socrates is immortal. So when we say that rationality might be the basis of morality, what that means is, well, there are some philosophers who think that the immoral actions are the irrational actions, that immorality and irrationality are the same thing. So someone who says that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, but denies that Socrates is immortal, is irrational in that sense. So too says someone like Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk about later. Kant says somebody who says that lying is morally good is saying something contradictory and irrational, just like the person in the Socrates man mortal case. Now, of course, I'm just here indicating what we will be talking about. I haven't been giving you any arguments for these positions or giving you any reasons to believe that they're true. The relativist said at the end of the day, when you examine each one of these things, none of them can do the work that we want it to do, and so the only thing that works is relativism. Well, of course, the absolutist thinks that at least one of these will work. And so we can't really evaluate the no foundation argument until we're in a position to decide as between these traditional options, or maybe even some other option that we haven't yet discussed. So this is a serious challenge. The no foundation argument is something that needs to be dealt with. So the point here, though, is that the no foundation argument is a serious challenge to the moral absolutist. But at this point, we can't say that it's a decisive challenge. And so therefore, we still haven't found any reason to favor relativism. This is really only something which we can assess at the end of this class when we look back and ask ourselves, are any of these solutions viable? Do they work or do they not work? So this is the last argument that we'll look at for relativism. And of course, if you have any others that you think aren't covered by these three, then feel free to bring them up in the discussion board. So one common idea is that what a person should do is relative to the context that they find themselves in. So think about lying, for instance. Whether a person should lie or not depends on the situation. So think about the movie The Terminator. So when the Terminator is looking for John Connor and it asks his friend, have you seen John Connor? I'm going to arrest him or cause him some harm, actually kill him. The kid knows where John Connor is, but of course he doesn't tell the Terminator where John Connor is. He lies and says he doesn't know where he is. So in that case, it seems like lying is moral because you're lying to save a life. But of course, there are other times when lying doesn't seem moral, like for instance, when you lie merely to avoid being punished or to avoid dealing with an unpleasant situation. Those kinds of cases don't seem to be ones where lying is moral, whereas the Terminator kinds of cases do. So this argument goes, well, then what you should do is relative to a context. There's no rule, there's no absolute fact of the matter about whether lying is right or whether lying is wrong. So too, there's no absolute fact of the matter, this argument suggests, about whether killing is wrong. Sometimes it's moral to kill. Death penalty, self-defense, for instance, are common examples. Sometimes it's immoral to kill for pleasure or to avoid being punished, or to just enrich your life, like by getting money. So there's no absolute fact of the matter here. Now the problem with this argument is that it's not an argument for relativism. Recall that the relativist thinks that in the very same situation, two different actions could both be equally acceptable. So take the Terminator case. The subjectivist says, look, whether you lie to the Terminator depends on your personal preferences. If you feel like lying, go ahead. That's fine for you. If you don't, then don't. The cultural relativist will say, well, look, whether it's moral to lie to the Terminator depends on what the culture says. So if you're from a culture that accepts as permissible these kinds of lies, and you might make a case that our culture is that kind of culture, well, then it would be moral. However, if you're from a culture that forbids lying of even under these circumstances, it would be immoral to lie in that circumstance. So you could have two people in basically the same situation who did the opposite actions, and each of them could be right in some sense. But in the cases that we're considering, that's not what's going on. We're just saying in this situation, what's right is different than what's right in that situation. And that leaves the door open still for a kind of absolutism, but a kind of absolutism that takes account of these situational differences. And what's interesting is actually we'll see this when we get to talking about Aristotle and Kant after we're done with the meta-ethics part of the class and start talking about normative theories. So Kant is going to be someone who's an example of the typical absolutist who think that there is a moral rule which always is true for everyone at all times. So for instance, he thinks that do not lie is a universal moral truth that there are never any exceptions to, and do not lie is just like 2 plus 2 equals 4 in the sense that it's completely objective, independent of you, in no way can be violated, and never admits of exceptions. Whereas Aristotle thinks that whether or not one should lie depends on the situation one finds themselves in. And there isn't going to be a rule like do not lie, which is going to be universally true at all times. But even so, claims Aristotle, in every particular situation, there is always one and only one answer to the question, what's the right thing to do in that situation? So that's not relativism. Aristotle's an objectivist. He thinks that there are objective facts about what the right things to do are, but he denies that those things are made to be facts by being instances of a general rule. So we haven't got an argument for relativism at this point. What we've got is an argument which suggests maybe there's a more interesting kind of absolutism, the Aristotelian kind. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, what we're going to turn to next are arguments against relativism. All we've been doing in this section is looking at arguments for relativism. So if you remember our discussion of the cultural differences argument, what we found out there was that mere disagreement over the truths of ethics doesn't by itself show that there are no truths out there. It may merely show that we don't know what the truths are. And you can sort of see that the mistake that the relativist is making here is very natural to say that they are neglecting the distinction between descriptive ethics and normative ethics. So remember that descriptive ethics is simply the claim that a certain culture does in fact have various moral beliefs. So you're just describing the moral system of the people in question. Whereas normative ethics deals with the issue of not what is the case, but what should be the case, what ought to be the case. So the relativist says that the way things are is the way that they ought to be. But we can sensibly ask the question whether things ought to be the way that they are. So this is the basic idea behind the naturalistic fallacy, which the book talks about. The relativist simply equates the status quo with the normatively correct situation. So let's illustrate this with something of a fancy example. So consider two people who agreed about all the relevant facts of some given situation. So we can assume that there is a particular action in question, for instance, and they all agree on the facts, what happened, when it happened. There's no ambiguities. There's nothing that if they only knew this particular fact, it would resolve the issue. So suppose, for instance, we're talking about abortion, and there's two people, each of whom agrees on the total specification of the situation. So there's no issue, for instance, about whether the fetus is a person. Suppose they both agree the fetus is a person. Suppose they agree on all the relevant facts about when fetuses develop what capacities, when they first wiggle their toes, when they first smile, all the sorts of things, that are factual, physical facts about childbirth. Suppose they agree on all those facts. It seems as though these two people could still disagree about whether the abortion is good or not. So they could say, yes, I agree, the fetus is a person, but abortion is still moral because sometimes you can take an innocent life and to preserve your own, and for instance, etc. So now I'm not saying that this person would be right, but what we're saying is that there still could be a disagreement, even if all of the facts were agreed upon. Now, what does this illustrate? Well, here's another way of making that point, is to say that a complete description of the way the world factually is doesn't give you the correct normative claim. And this is, of course, something that has been coming out in our discussion about the cultural variations argument. So the fact that people disagree, that's a fact. That doesn't show that people that there is no moral truth. It doesn't show that the things that people believe is what they ought to believe. And you can see actually that it goes the other way as well. Even if it were the case that there was universal agreement on some issue, say for instance, whether slavery was morally permissible or not. So even if it were the case that you had total agreement amongst all human beings about slavery being allowed, it still wouldn't follow that slavery was morally right. You could still sensibly disagree about the moral status of slavery. So the way the world is, descriptive facts don't seem to get you normative facts. And this is the idea behind the naturalistic fallacy that the book talks about. So closely related to the naturalistic fallacy, and something we're going to be discussing again and again in these lectures, is a very famous argument known as the open question argument, first introduced by G.E. Moore in the early 1900s. So take water, for instance. Water has certain properties which you can observe. So it's liquid. Liquids behave in certain ways, and water behaves in that way. When it freezes, it turns into a solid, which we call ice, and solids behave in certain ways, and so we can say of water the way that it behaves. Now, after thousands of years of investigation of the natural world, we've discovered that water is H2O. How did we discover that water was H2O? Well, we did some experiments, getting some water and breaking it down into its parts and trying to identify those parts. But really what allows us to identify water with H2O is the fact that we're able to explain all of the properties that water has simply by appealing to the properties that H2O has. So, for instance, when you talk about water, H2O molecules, hydrogen, two hydrogens being bonded to an oxygen, giving a complete physical description of that, it's such like you might get in your chemistry class, an advanced chemistry class. You would learn all about the way the molecules bond to other molecules and the way hydrogen bonds to oxygen and the forces that connect them. And you would find out that when the bond between the molecules is relatively loose, so that they're not really glued onto each other, so to speak, they're relatively easy to separate, but they sort of cling together. That's the state that we call water, and liquid water, excuse me. And when water is in that state, room temperature, by which we mean there's a certain amount of energy in the system, you could explain the way you can put your hand through it. It rolls off of things. It clumps together, but will roll around. So you can explain all those properties in terms of the properties of H2O. And you can tell this story continuously through the other two states that water enters. So if you heat it up, you start putting energy into the system, these ions, which are loosely bonded, then start breaking off and moving around. Or in other words, it turns into a gas, and so they don't clump together in the way that they were before, but just start freely forming vapors. And you can also explain why ice turns into a solid by talking about how you're removing energy from the system. We call that lowering the temperature so that the molecules move slower and slower. They have less energy, and they get more and more bonded until they basically form a lattice structure where they're all rigidly bound in a tight lattice formation, and that's what we call ice. So knowing about H2O and all of its properties in complete detail gives you all of the properties of water. Now, once you get to the point where you understand that water is H2O at this scientific level, there's no longer a question that you can ask of the form. Yes, I see that there's H2O there, but is there water there? In other words, if you really understand how H2O behaves, and you know that there's some H2O around, then you know that there's water around. Doesn't make sense to say, well, it has all the properties that H2O has, but is it going to be water? Now, here's another way of illustrating this point. So consider something like bachelor. It doesn't make any sense of someone who really understands the English word bachelor to say to you, yeah, I know that there's an unmarried male over there, but is there a bachelor over there? You see, that question is closed because being a bachelor just is being an unmarried male. And once you really understand what a bachelor is, there's no longer a question about whether an unmarried male is a bachelor. Just like in the case of water, once you really understand what H2O is, there's no longer a question about whether H2O is water. But in the case of ethics, it seems different. Someone could have a complete description of any action and still ask, yeah, but is it good? And that's basically what we were just talking about a second ago. So, in fact, it seems like anything we try to identify with being good will have this problem. We're going to come back to this point later. That's going to turn out to be very important. But for right now, we're just making a point against relativism. So take any given cultural practice, slavery, for instance. We can ask, is it right? Free speech. Is it right that we have free speech? What does that mean? But if we can ask that question, even if we understand all the relevant facts, then being good cannot be the same thing as the relevant cultural norm. Because we can say, yes, we understand what the norm is, but we want to know, is it a good norm? Is it good? And of course, we can say the same thing for any given preference. Say, for instance, as the subjectivists will say, somebody has a preference for stealing. They enjoy stealing. We can ask, oh, but is it good? Now, notice that we can't ask, is it good to steal? Notice that we can't ask those kinds of questions for fashion or preferences for ice cream. So we can say, yes, we understand that the Scots wear kilts, but is it right to wear a kilt? Yes, I understand that this culture wears a necktie in a formal attire, but is it proper to wear a necktie? Well, the only answer is in that culture, yes. In other cultures, maybe not. And again, for preferences for ice cream, it doesn't make sense to ask the question, yes, I see that he has a preference for chocolate ice cream, but is it good to have a preference for chocolate ice cream? You say, well, no, that's just his preference. So there seems to be a difference between the way moral judgments work and the way these other kinds of obviously relativistic judgments work. So the open question argument and the naturalistic fallacy clearly pose a problem for relativism. Now what we're going to find out is they also pose a problem for a lot of other moral views, and that's something that's interesting about this naturalistic fallacy, is that it has a surprisingly wide target range. And so right now we're only looking at how it applies to relativism, but we'll see that it applies to in a bunch of other areas as well. So we've looked at several problems for relativism already. It doesn't have any arguments which support it. In each case, the arguments which seemingly support it are really in support of something else. So the cultural variations argument gives us reason for skeptical conclusion, not a metaphysical conclusion. The situational differences argument merely suggests that there may be more varieties of moral absolutism than we thought. There's a rule version of absolutism and maybe a no rule version of absolutism. So, but that's not an argument for relativism. In fact, there seems to be a serious problem with the claim that goodness or rightness is identical to a preference or a cultural norm because it seemingly commits the naturalistic fallacy and is vulnerable to the open question argument. So the no foundation argument, as we were just talking about, isn't conclusive until we've examined all of the various options that are out there, which we haven't even begun to do yet. So we haven't found any reason really to take relativism seriously. It's maybe an intuitive view, but so far we haven't found anything that really supports it. And in fact, when you look closer at the view, there are all sorts of problems with it. So now what I want to do is to start talking about the problems which result when you actually just take the theory at face value. And what's going to emerge is that it doesn't really connect up with the way we ordinarily talk or think about morality. So, for instance, suppose that relativism is true. Well, if relativism is true, then what's morally right is simply dependent on what a culture thinks is morally right, what norms they in fact do have. Well, if that's the case, then there's no way to say that any moral values are better or worse than any other moral values. You can't ever say that what Hitler did was worse than what we do. That free speech and the rights afforded to us by the Constitution is a better way of governing people than rounding up minorities and putting them to death by the millions. We can't say that one of those is better than the other because remember, the relativist is saying, well, no, it's just a different way of doing things. Sure, we don't agree that you should murder millions of people simply because of their ethnicity, but the Nazis did, and that's the way that they do things. But that clearly seems strange because we do make these kinds of judgments. Hopefully when you just saw the things up there that I flashed, namely that we can't say that what Hitler did was really wrong, or that killing innocent people for fun is really wrong. We can't say that according to the relativist. I hope you were thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, those things do seem really wrong. Describing cases of someone hammering in the head of an individual for fun seems to be something which is clearly, obviously wrong. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that moral absolutism seems to provide a better explanation for why we think this and for the way we actually talk and think about morality. And notice that this was the point that Dr. Chafee was making in the book. So when he had the little discussion between the subjectivist and the non-subjectivist, and the person says, what's morally right depends on your opinion and what you think. The other person says, oh, great, then I'll take your computer. To which the other person objected, hey, you can't do that. Well, if subjectivism is true, that's not an objection. But of course, that's a natural objection. We always do act as though we think some rules are absolute. Now, of course, we disagree about which rules are absolutes, but we don't act as though, oh, it's just like chocolate. So if you're thinking about, by which I mean it's just your preference. So if you're thinking about which theory actually fits with the way we think and talk about morality, the point here that the book is making is that the theory that fits best is moral absolutism. That actually fits more with the way we think and talk about morality. Now, besides this, there's not even really a coherent thesis on the table of cultural relativism. So who is the group supposed to be when they say the culture determines what's morally right? So suppose you're from more than one culture. Well, okay, so you could be from the U.S. They could be talking about corporate culture. Are there two separate cultures there or not? What about, is there such a thing as hip hop culture? And what about people who dissent from their cultures. We're going to be forced to say that people like Jesus and Martin Luther King, Dr. King, are immoral and etc. That doesn't seem to be right. Now, notice what the point here is. When you actually start to ask what the theory of cultural relativism is, it's not clear that they can even say what it is, because it's not clear what they mean by a culture. If they simply mean the U.S., well, there may be some things that you can say is typical of people in the United States, like belief in free speech, perhaps, belief in certain basic rights that are in the Constitution, like the right to speedy trial and representation and freedom of religion and so on. You might say that those are the things that we believe, but for a lot of these things, you can't. What is the American view of abortion? Is it moral? Is it immoral? Is it permissible? Is it not? Well, you have people divided. So then you have to get more fine-grained. In Catholic culture, they think this. In liberal culture, they think that. But eventually, you'll find disagreements even in those groups. And it looks like you're going to be sliding all the way back down into some kind of subjectivism. So really, when you look at it, cultural relativism looks like nothing more than a form of subjectivism. And of course, subjectivism, as we've already previously discussed, just doesn't seem serious at all. It seems ludicrous to say that whether taking a newborn baby and smashing its head against a rock is morally good or not depends on a person's preferences. It just seems too ludicrous to take seriously. So it looks like there's a problem here, even trying to formulate the view that morality depends on a culture. Now, the dissenter problem is a big problem, because it looks like, according to moral relativism, Dr. Martin Luther King was immoral. If you say, well, look, okay, what Americans believe is that slavery is morally permissible. So he's fighting that, therefore he goes against what's morally right for his culture. He's a member of American culture, so he's immoral. But wait a minute, isn't he a member of black culture too? And they don't think that slavery is immoral. So now Dr. Martin Luther King is in two cultures. He's in the U.S. culture. He is in black culture. In one culture, what he's doing is immoral. In the other culture, what he's doing is moral. So which is it? The relativist says, well, it depends on which culture he's from. But of course, the problem here is that he's from both of those cultures. So there's no way to say what's morally right for him. And of course, this problem isn't just specific to Dr. Martin Luther King. It's a general problem for a diverse culture like ours. So cultural relativism may have made a lot more sense in the times when cultures were basically monolithic. But in a multicultural society like ours, where many people are in more than one culture at once, it doesn't make any sense at all. Because you say, well, say for instance, you're Puerto Rican and you have Puerto Rican culture, your family's from Puerto Rico, but you also were raised in the United States. So you have sort of pushing and pulling influences on you. Puerto Rican culture says do one thing, American culture says do another thing. Well, what are you supposed to do? Which one of those things is morally right? The relativist says, well, neither of them are really morally right. It depends on which culture you're a member of. But this person's a member of both culture. So you have a contradiction here. Namely, it's both morally right and wrong for this person to do the kinds of actions that we're thinking about. That's crazy, though. Now, to sort of pile on top of this, we completely lose any sense or any ability to explain what's going on when cultures change or when people disagree cross-culturally. So, if what is moral is simply what a culture thinks is moral, then there would never be any reason for a culture to change its mind. So take, for example, the United States. We used to believe that slavery was morally correct. Now, we do not think that slavery is morally correct. Well, what happened? Excuse me, some paper just fell. Well, what happened? Well, it seems quite natural to say what happened was we used to think that slavery was morally right. We've realized we were wrong about that through the efforts of a lot of people. And then we got rid of slavery because we realized we had made a mistake. But of course, you can't have that explanation if you're a relativist, because there was never a time at which there was an error. So look, here's another way to put the problem here. If relativism is right, then every culture has already got the right moral code. It's the one they actually have. But if you've already got the right moral code, what reason would there ever be to change it? Seems like there's a problem then explaining why cultures actually change. Now here's another problem. Suppose that I'm arguing with a person from Saudi Arabia who thinks that women shouldn't be taught. Seems to me as though we disagree about something. So they say it's wrong to teach women how to read. I say no, it's right to teach women how to read. But if relativism is true, then we are each saying something true. Because when the person from Saudi Arabia says teaching women to read is wrong, that's right. In their culture, it is wrong to teach women to read. So according to the relativist, it's true that in Saudi Arabia, it's immoral to teach women to read. So when this person from that culture says that, he's saying something which is true relative to his culture. Now, of course, the same is true for me. When I say it's right to teach women to read, I'm saying something which is true relative to my culture. So when you actually bring in the relativism, it turns out that this person from Saudi Arabia and myself are not really disagreeing about anything. They're saying something which is true for them. I'm saying something which is true for me. But of course, in order for there to be real disagreement, one of us has to be saying something that the other thinks is false. But of course, we're not. We're each saying something that the other can recognize as true, which doesn't seem to capture what's going on when we argue about morality. That's the point there. It seems like we're really disagreeing about some fact, whether it's right to teach women to read, not some relative fact. Notice that we don't get that feeling when we're talking about the taste of ice cream. If someone told us that we really didn't disagree about whether chocolate was good, but we were merely expressing our preferences for chocolate or not chocolate, we would, on reflection, I think, say, okay, that's fine. We're not losing anything when we realize, finally, that chocolate isn't good in and of itself, but it only depends on the preference of the person. Whereas we do, I think, react like we're losing something in this case, which indicates there's, again, a difference between our preferences and moral judgments. Okay, so now take a case of disagreements. For instance, the Inuit case that we talked about earlier in class, in the lectures. So suppose that you found out that Inuits left their children out on the ice to die. One natural way of interpreting this is that we disagree with the Inuits over whether murder is morally right or not. But it doesn't seem as though we really do disagree that murder is right or not, since calling something a murder is calling something an unjustified killing. So by definition, not all killings are murders. In order for a killing to be a murder, it has to be an unjustified killing. So it seems in the Inuit case, what's really going on is not that we disagree over whether murder is morally right. The Inuits agree with us about that. Murder is morally wrong. What we disagree about is whether the killing of the baby is a murder or not. So we're going to say that's murder because we are merely just saying that's an unjustified killing. The Inuit's going to respond, no, that's not a murder. That's a justified killing. And in fact, they offer justification in terms of scarcity of resources. So they say something like this. We only have enough food, shelter, etc. for 5 people. Including that baby makes 6 people. We don't have the resources for everybody. So somebody has to not be fed. That person would starve to death. We can't let one of the adults starve to death because we need them to perpetuate the making of the resources, hunting, gathering, making stuff. The baby can't do any of that stuff. So we can't feed the infant over somebody else because everybody will die off. So it becomes, in some very specific cases, it becomes an instance of, is it better to let this baby die slowly over time, painfully starving to death? Or is it better to just put it out on the ice where it will freeze? It gets sleepy, it gets cold, it gets sleepy. It's relatively less painful, less suffering is involved. And so they conclude that overall it's justified, they're justified in leaving the baby out there. Now, we may think they're not justified in leaving the baby out there. But what we're disagreeing about is whether there's justification, which is to make this a normative disagreement. So what we're doing then is engaging in moral theorizing, and what we need to bring in is, for instance, if you know this stuff, you'll realize what the Inuits are bringing in is something like a utilitarian justification, whereas your feelings that this is bad probably are rooted in some kind of deontological consideration about innocent life and not taking it. So there are normative intuitions which are at work here, but we haven't really got a disagreement between us and the Inuit about whether murder is wrong. Now, what this seems to suggest is that some moral values are universal. So, remember earlier we talked about the cultural variations argument. What we were doing there was asking ourselves, does disagreement about morality entail that there is no facts about morality? We saw that that was a bad argument. Now what we're doing is revisiting that issue and actually asking ourselves, is it the case that there really is as much disagreement about morality as there seems? And the last considerations seem to suggest that there isn't. In fact, it seems as though we can identify some moral values as universally shared. So, even in cases that seem wildly at odds with our moral values, are really, when you examine them, cases of an acceptance of an underlying moral principle being applied in a different way. So, for instance, in the Inuit American case, we both agree murder is wrong. Unjustified killing is wrong. What we disagree about is what counts as justification and when are killings justified. We accept the moral value, murder is wrong. Because of differing views about what the nature of goodness is, we disagree about whether there's justification for that killing, but that's a straightforward normative disagreement of the kind that we encounter every day. That's not some deep disagreement of the kind that the relativists wanted to make a bunch of, because what the relativist was claiming was that there are no moral values which are universally shared, that everywhere we look there are people with wildly different moral values. In fact, it seems like some moral values have to be shared. So think about this for a second. Suppose that there were a society that placed no value on their children at all. Now notice the Inuits weren't like that. It's a very painful decision in Inuit society to have to leave an infant out on the ice. They only do it in those rare instances when they feel they must. There couldn't be a society that just had total disdain for their offspring. They would die out, in one generation. Suppose that, in fact, there was a society that did not make the distinction between justified killings and unjustified killings, so that they really thought that murder was morally acceptable. Now that's what it would mean for a culture to think that murder was morally acceptable. They would have to just say all killings are morally acceptable. We make no distinction between killing for fun, killing in self-defense, killing for pleasure, killing because you're bored, killing to get your way, killing because out of revenge or killing in a war. All those things are the same. Killing is do it whenever you want. Suppose that there was a culture that said that. Well, they too would soon die out, because if killing for boredom was allowed, eventually people would not be around long enough to reproduce. So it seems like you can identify a small set of values which all cultures must share. But if so, cultural relativism is false. Now, what does differ from society to society are normative theories. And that is the right point to make. And we'll see briefly later, we can discuss this if you want. But there is an issue about where relativism is best cast. So you might say, look, at the meta-ethical level, relativism is false. So there are some absolute moral values. But nonetheless, at the normative level, there's relativism, because you can't say which moral theory is the best moral theory. And that does turn out to be a bit of an issue. We'll come back to that. We'll have to evaluate these theories. Now, I want to end this discussion of relativism by talking about a logical problem. So recall that relativism is the claim that there is no absolute truth about morality. But ask yourself this, is that claim supposed to be true? Well, if it is, then there is no absolute truth about morality. But relativism is a truth about morality. So if relativism is true, it looks like it's a relative truth. But if it's merely a relative truth, it's not very interesting, because when someone says relativism is true, all they're really doing is expressing their opinion. My opinion is that relativism is false. And if my opinion is correct, then your opinion is false. Now suppose they replied, no, you can't do that because relativism is true. But if that's a relative truth, then it's true for them, but it could be false for me. So I say it's false for me, and what's true for me is absolutism. And absolutism, by the way, is true for everyone. So it's true for you. So if relativism is supposed to be a relative truth, it's quickly refuted by any absolutist. But if it's not a relative truth, then there is at least one truth about morality. Now look, here's the way of thinking about this. What the relativist is ultimately saying is, look, everything is relative except what I just said. But that's, of course, to contradict themselves. Because if everything is relative, then what they just said is relative. But, of course, the relativist doesn't want what they're saying to be relative. They want that to be absolutely true, and for everything else to be relative. But that doesn't make any sense. Now, relativists usually respond to this by pointing out that relativism is a meta-ethical claim about morality and not a normative claim. So, relativism is the claim that all judgments of right and wrong, good and bad, are relative to a culture. And this is a very famous response to this kind of self-refutation point that we've been making. So what they say is, look, we're making a meta-ethical claim about the status of normative judgments, but we're not making a normative judgment. So the judgment we're making isn't relative. It's not a contradiction to say the normative judgments are relative, but the meta-ethical judgment isn't relative. Okay, so that's the way that relativists typically respond to this self-refutation point. They simply go meta, as we say, and go up a level, pointing out that they're making a claim about the way that moral judgment works, that a moral judgment is only true relative to a culture. Now, finally, summing all of this up, we've been beating up relativism pretty seriously for the last couple of weeks, and we got to be careful, because there is something that you want to encourage in the relativists. People usually are drawn to relativism because of a desire to be tolerant, and that's a good thing. We want to be tolerant of other people's cultures and beliefs. And simply because a person doesn't share our beliefs doesn't automatically mean that that person is wrong or crazy or doing something which isn't normal. But that doesn't mean that morality is relative. Surely every culture has a continuum of beliefs, some of which are really relative, like which side of the street they decide to drive on. Surely is a relative one. In the US on the right side, and in Britain on the left side, but none of us is really doing it correctly, whereas the other one is doing it incorrectly. We are not going to invade Britain and force them to drive on the correct side of the street. That doesn't even make any kind of sense at all. But just because that's true, it doesn't mean that everything is culturally relative. So there are going to be some things which really are culturally relative and some things which aren't. And the point of moral education is to allow us to distinguish which is which. So we can recognize the sort of basic intuition here. Tolerance is good. We should tolerate other people's varying beliefs, but only to a limit. We shouldn't tolerate everything. We shouldn't tolerate the Holocaust. Notice also that this desire for tolerance is inconsistent with relativism. Someone who advances tolerance of other people's beliefs is making an absolute normative claim. You should tolerate other people's beliefs. Now, how do you know that they're making a claim that they think is absolute? You can tell by what happens when you say, no, you shouldn't tolerate other people's beliefs. They typically respond like, yes, you should, which is an indication that they think it's a fact. Let's illustrate this with an example. Suppose that there were a culture of relativists, a culture of everybody who thought that relativism was true. So they explicitly endorsed relativism as a culture. They thought that what other cultures did was their own business. They wouldn't do things that way. They find it distasteful. But they say, we also find chocolate to be delicious, whereas that culture doesn't like chocolate. They prefer vanilla. So we find chocolate distasteful. They find vanilla distasteful. What are you going to do? Well, now suppose that this culture ran into a group of people who thought that they should take over the world because they were given a divine right to enslave every person on the earth. Well, the cultural relativists, by their own position, has to say, well, that's an interesting moral system, not the way we would do things, but interesting. But then, of course, it's silly to say that because cultural relativism is true, they should let this other culture enslave them. They shouldn't tolerate this other culture who's going around domineering, abusing other people. The tolerance has to end somewhere. Tolerance has to end somewhere. Okay, so that's the lecture on relativism.